There is an overwhelming evidence showing that the government's counterinsurgency forces under the command of the Indian Intelligence Agency carried out the massacre of its own people in Kashmir during President Clinton's visit to India to defame Pakistan. Could this evidence be used against India in declaring it a terrorist country? All next with Kenneth Cooper, Washington Post national education writer. As a former New Delhi bureau chief, Mr. Cooper covered a variety of news on the Asian subcontinent. He has been a recipient of a Pulitzer Prize for excellence in journalism. Chris Ganya, research associate with the Stimson Center. George Nesterchuk, a former staff director for the U.S. House of Representatives. And Dr. Nazir Hussain, a visiting fellow with the Stimson Center. Joining us remotely from New York is Barbara Crossett of the New York Times. Ms. Crossett has excellent credentials as a journalist and a columnist and has been a New Delhi News Bureau Chief for the New York Times.
Barbara, what was your impression that the government officials indeed carried out that campaign of so-called genocide in a covert fashion to...
that I would never know. And as one knows very well, it's very difficult to get to the bottom of things in India. I always say that one of the great gaps in Indian journalism is a real investigative reporting arm for many of the big newspapers, because it seems to me. But I take the evidence that was collected by others and the many conversations I've had with Sikh families. I then went back to Delhi as a correspondent, and so in 1984, in 84 and 89 and into the 90s, I would keep in touch with some of these families. The finger seemed to point more to Congress party officials than to any kind of official government act. The idea that, of course, Mrs. Gandhi had been killed was enough to fire some Congress party people. Where I would investigate further, were I able to do so as a reporter, would be in the question of negligence after this took place and during the time it was taking place. Mm-hmm. I think those things have never been adequately dealt with at an official level. Now, and this comes back to your very first question. This is a democracy. Can you imagine a big democracy where that many people would be killed, singled out for their religion, and that nobody would pay the price? A government would fall, something would happen, there would be impeachment proceedings, but nothing happened, nothing. And I think this is what, of course, the Kashmiri people are also experiencing in a different way, on a different scale, for other reasons. By the way, I might say on Kashmir, one of the most interesting things to come out recently was the massacre of Sikhs in that village. Mm-hmm. For the first time, local people demanded autopsies, exhumations. People demanded identities. And I think in this country now and in Canada, people are beginning to chronicle things that happened to Sikhs, not in the big 1984 events, but systematically over a period of time. These secret cremations, which a group in Canada is documenting, and also the human rights leader, Ram Narayan Kumar, has also written a piece for University College Oxford on this. These things are in a way a step forward. They are made possible by the fact that it is a democracy. That's a very interesting fact and must be said. But I think it's just beginning now in India that people are demanding accounting.
There is an overwhelming, George, evidence supporting the allegation that the government's counterinsurgency forces under the command of the Indian Intelligence Agency carried out the massacre of its own people in Kashmir during President Clinton's visit to India to defame Pakistan. And could this, what do you think of this? Is this an evidence adding up to India's list of terrorist acts, the most recent?
Well, I don't know. Again, terrorist acts are difficult for me to define in terms of some of these behaviors. They're reprehensible. They're not what we in the U.S. usually associate with terrorist act, even state terrorism. Because these are in some ways aberrations, political aberrations of a government, of a state in dealing with its own people. So I'm not exactly sure that that's how we define terrorism here in the United States. Nevertheless, as I said, it's reprehensible behavior. It doesn't speak well of the country. And at some point, there will be consequences for it. You know, it's difficult to strive for some kind of intervention. The UN is supposed to be a forum where we raise those kinds of issues. But when you're dealing with democratic states or unfazed democratic states, the definition of a democratic state also implies that there are processes and procedures in place internally to deal with aberrations, to deal with problems. So there's a tendency for us to give the benefit of the doubt to India. Yes, there are problems there, but there are mechanisms and procedures to redress these wrongs, and you just have to give them time, sufficient time to come into play. So I don't see, your question about pulling wool over people's eyes, political wool and all that. That's not just necessarily the case. There's a process at play. And one assumes that India, for all of its imperfections, still has mechanisms in place that many non-democratic states don't have, and that sooner or later these will redress the wrongs.
India does have constitutional, legal mechanisms in place, as George says, to address issues of inequality. Should the country be focusing on implementing those provisions? Is that where the problem is?
I think that's a big part of the problem, certainly. The legal bureaucracy in India is notoriously slow. It's partly a consequence of just having so many people to process, partly a problem of bureaucratic culture. This is certainly something that India is going to have to focus on if it wishes to maintain internal peace and security and a secular functioning democracy, or at least improve what it has now. Certainly.
So you can have people in Bangalore with computer technology and so on, but what about 400 million, 600 million others? And that is a national problem that the outside world really can't deal with. That's something India is going to have to deal with itself. And each year that goes by, you'll notice President Narayanan last summer, I think it was at the at the Independence celebrations. Or was it Republic Day? I think it was Republic Day this year. Mm-hmm. Gave a very tough speech about the bottom of the social scale in India and how something radical had to be done. Otherwise, will there be more caste warfare? Will there be literally the danger of starvation at some point if there are 2 or 3 bad harvests? Mm-hmm. And so on. I think, that's the problem seems to be that while everyone agrees it's a big country with big problems, we would also then look for big solutions.
Do you come down on?
They certainly need to improve them, and I don't know about this particular government, which was responsible for the nuclear tests and seems to have some concerns about external security, but the 2 governments previous to that were very clear in understanding that India's greatest security challenges were internal security matters. In fact, former Prime Minister R.K. Gujral was telling me about a conversation he had with Primakov, the Russian leader, and Gujral was inquiring, why did the Soviet Union fall apart? And Primakov's response was something to the effect that it wasn't a problem of external security, it was internal security, which broke down. And so there are political leaders in India that understand that this is its biggest security challenge, and that repression is not going to solve the problem. It just stanches it for a moment and it resurfaces, and then you have to do something about the underlying inequalities and tensions.
It was an interesting example with the Soviet Union and Primakov, because their speculation is that Gorbachev, when he came to power, really didn't understand what the real glue was that was holding the Soviet system together. And that glue was state terrorism. Total repression. Minorities, religious minorities, national minorities. Something that Lenin and Stalin fully understood. That's why they were so brutal towards their own population. And if there's any lesson from that, is if India is concerned about internal security and has to resort to repression, then perhaps it's not a natural state as it's currently constrained by its borders.